Welcome to everyone in today's lecture of milk ejection reflex, which is also called as laid down reflex. We go through the introduction. First, we see what this reflex is. This is a neuroendocrine reflex that releases milk from the mammary alveoli into ducts for infant suckling. Next, we see what hormone are going to act during this reflex. Primarily, the oxytocin hormone act, and secondarily, prolactin hormone is also playing some role in this reflex. Next, we see what neural action is going to be happen during this reflex. First, the stimulus come from the infant suckling, which send stimulus to the sensory nerves, and next we see that the sensory nerves send those stimulus to the hypothalamus, and then hypothalamus releases oxytocin or synthesizes oxytocin for further activities of this reflex. Next, we see the mammary gland structure. Here you can see in the figure that uh, this is a breast, and inside the breast there are so many lobes, lactiferous lobes, and inside the lactiferous lobes you can see there is uh, so many alveoli are acini, which constitute of the myoepithelial cells. So you can see this structure that constitute of the myoepithelial cells, which is attached with the basement membrane with the help of the desmosomes or desmosomes, and that constitute of the milk protein, which is released from this acini or alveoli once this myoepithelial cell gets contracted with the help of the hormones like the oxytocin. And we see here that alveoli, that is a milk producing sacs that is lined with the myoepithelial cell that we saw here. And next we saw the ducts, that is a lactiferous ducts. This is a duct. When this myoepithelial cell get contracted, then these milk proteins or other secretion of this alveoli are just secreted through this duct into here, and the baby sucked through the nipple. Next, we see the myoepithelial cells that contract in response to the oxytocin and is squeezing the milk into the ducts that we discussed here. Next, we see the neural pathway or the suckling stimulus from where it is coming. Here we see the infant suckling activates the mechanoreceptors in the nipple, and these stimulus from the mechanoreceptor to the afferent pathway via the spinal cord, uh, from the spinal cord T4 to T6 reaches to the brainstem and then hypothalamus. And next we see that hypothalamus constitute of many nuclei. Paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei of the hypothalamus mainly synthesize the oxytocin and other hormones that are secreted with the help of the pituitary, posterior pituitary. Next, we see the hormonal control or oxytocin release. Posterior pituitary releases the stored oxytocin into the blood. Generally, the paraventricular nuclei and the supraoptic nuclei of the hypothalamus synthesize oxytocin and ADH, and those are stored in the Herring's bodies, that are the nerve terminals coming from the axon of the nerve fibers that connect both hypothalamus as well as the posterior pituitary. So once they are stimulated, then Herring's body that has stored those oxytocin and ADS that are released once the posterior pituitary gland is stimulated due to certain reason. And here, when that posterior pituitary gland or hypothalamus is stimulated, then the stored oxytocin is released into the blood. Next, we see what happens once the oxytocin is released. Oxytocin that work by the G protein coupled receptor, which is present in the myoepithelial cell, and that receptor is GQ coupled receptor, and once it gets stimulated with the help of this oxytocin, then that will release the secondary chemical messengers like IP3 and DAG, diacylglycerol, and inositol 1,4,5 triphosphate. Such secondary messengers are released once this GQ coupled receptor gets stimulated with the binding of the oxytocin to this receptor. Then that will trigger the release of the calcium in the cell, in the myoepithelial cells, and that calcium lead to the contraction of the myoepithelial cells. You can see here the suckling of the baby send the stimulus through the um, stimulation of the mechanoreceptor present in the nipple, and that goes through the spinal cord to T4 to T6, then reaches to brain stems, and then stimulate the supraoptic nucleus and paraventricular nucleus present in the hypothalamus, and that will send stimulus to the there is a certain Herring's bodies which store oxytocin, and then that is released, and that oxytocin bind to the G-coupled receptors present in the myepithelial cells, and then trigger the contraction of that myepithelial cell, and finally leading to the milk ejection. Next, we see what's the role of prolactin. As we had discussed that this is a secondary hormone that is acting in the milk or let down reflex. There we see the suckling also stimulates the prolactin to be released from the anterior pituitary, and its action is to form the milk, that is galactopoiesis. And here we can see this is the prolactin releasing hormone which has been secreted from the anterior pituitary, and this mainly help in the formation of the or synthesis of the milk that is stored within the lumen of the alveoli or acini of the lactiferous lobules. Next, we see what factors influence milk ejection. Mainly here we discuss about the positive modulators and the negative modulators. Positive modulators will be those factors which just accelerate the milk ejection process, and we see the infant dependent stimuli, where the suckling is a primary trigger which stimulate the mechanoreceptors from where the stimulus reaches to hypothalamus through the various afferent pathways. And next is infant cry or smell, and auditory or olfactory cues that activate hypothalamic oxytocin release. Next is maternal factors. Maternal factor could be like the psychological comfort, that means what type of bonding or the depth of the bonding between mother and child, and relaxation also, how much more the mom is relaxed, and positive emotions like the hearing baby's voice, that all these things will increase the oxytocin. And next is breast warmth or massage, that will also stimulate the tactile receptors present in the breast. And next is conditions response, like the suppose the mom is feeding the baby in the morning at 6 a.m., then every day at the 6 a.m. oxytocin will be released more and more, and that is called the conditioned response. That is time based feeding routines can trigger oxytocin pre-suckling. Next is physiological states, which could be like skin to skin contact, that we also think like the bonding, where the oxytocin release is enhanced by the somatosensory pathways. Next, there is full breasts. Stretch receptors in the alveoli promote reflex. Once the milk proteins and the all other components of the milk get fully concentrated within the alveoli, then that will stretch the breast, and that will send stimulus through the stress receptor to the hypothalamus to release the oxytocin. So this can also provide a positive feedback to the release of the milk. Next we see the negative modulators. What negative modulators does is they just reduces the release of the milk or ejection of the milk from the breast, like the stress and hormonal interference, where there is the release of adrenaline, uh, and that lead to the sympathetic activation and pain, anxiety, and that what finally does is that will reduce the oxytocin. Next is cortisol, which is also called as stress hormone, and that will blunts oxytocin synthesis in the hypothalamus. And next is pharmacological agents like the dopamine agonist, bromocriptine. Such things also suppress the prolactin. What prolactin does is that will synthesize milk, and once this is suppressed, then the milk formation will be less, and that directly or indirectly will reduce the milk ejection. Since there will be a reduced amount of the milk, then our ejection will be accelerated. Next is opioids, NSAIDs. High doses of opioids and NSAIDs may inhibit the oxytocin release, and environmental factors also influence the release of milk, like distractions or noise that will disrupt the maternal focus. And next is nipple damage, pain that inhibits the afferent neural signals, and pathological conditions can also lead to reduced release of the oxytocin, like hypothyroidism that alters the prolactin or oxytocin balance, and hypopituitarism, Sheehan's syndrome. There is oxytocin deficiency with the hypopituitarism. All the um, hormones that has been secreted from this pituitary gland, that all will be compromised in the hypopituitarism. So these pathological conditions can act as a negative modulators in case of the milk ejection. And this much.